Ladies and gentlemen, in this Gamers.com video, we're going to be talking about the PlayStation 4K, also known as Neo, and whether the PlayStation 5 may never happen. It's possible that Neo and iterative consoles, that would be the likes of the Xbox 1.5, are the future of the industry. Several developers have hinted this actually over the past 24 hours, including Lorne Lanning. Lorne is responsible for titles such as the Oddworld games, and he has just gone on record during a podcast. And during this podcast, where he was talking with the folks over at Game Informer, he recounted a conversation he had with Shuhei Yoshida over, of course, at PlayStation. When he asked Shuhei Yoshida, what does the PlayStation 5 look like, he said, "You mean if?" And then he continued by saying that this was Shuhei. He said, "We need to be more agile. None of us know what the future looks like, so how do we adapt to it?" The crux of the argument is that by the time consoles become, let's say, 3 years or 4 years old, the hardware is, well, basically ancient in computing terms. The PS4 is already pretty outdated if you were to compare it to even a mid-range PC, and as smartphones become more and more powerful, and of course as their market share starts to increase, and with the movement towards virtual reality and other such derivative hardware, it's fair to say that we can't really have 10-year cycles anymore, or even 7-year cycles. Even 5 years is a bit long in the tooth. Now we need to release hardware a lot faster. At least that's the thinking of companies such as Sony. Now, this is an opinions piece to a degree from myself, and this is also an article which you can read as well, because I'm going to come at this a little bit different from both written and verbal, because I want this to be more of a discussion with you guys in the verbal piece. That would obviously be this particular video. So it's fair to say that when Sony, or rather when the news of Neo was first leaked and everyone started to discuss it, there was some folks who really liked the idea that, well, it was fully backwards compatible with the original PS4. So just to be clear, just that everyone is on the same page, there is going to be no Neo-specific software. So in other words, if God of War 4 or, Last of Us 2 comes out in 2017, and it says Neo-compatible on it, and obviously I'm just giving an example here, and you pop it into your vanilla, regular, base PS4, it will still load. So there are going to be some differences, of course, but that's where the difficulty comes. Now I'm going to give a very basic overview of the difference between the specifications of the systems. I say basic overview because we've gone into this exhaustively yesterday, but I just want to keep everyone onto the same page. So the difference, of course, is you've got 500 MHz increase on the CPU. That's 2.1 GHz compared to 1.6 GHz. You've got double the amount of GCN units. So you've got, compute units. So you've got 36 compute units compared to 18 compute units. And Neo is using Polaris, and it's running at 911 MHz. And you've also got the faster memory bus as well, faster memory bandwidth. With the Neo, it's running at 218 GB per second compared to 176 GB per second, and essentially you're looking at a performance around 2.27 times greater with the GPU alone, which is quite the difference. Now, it's quite interesting because if you put the game into a Neo system, the game will have basically a Neo mode. The software will scan the system, say, oh, it's running on the super duper deluxe PlayStation 4. Hey, that means it's got access to this. We've got access to these extra resources, and it will basically make the game look prettier. But it's really down to the developers. So, from what we understand from the information that's leaked, Sony are not going to enforce certain criteria on the developers to a degree. So for the sake of argument, they're not going to say, well, the game has to run at a 50% higher resolution. They're not going to say that the game has to run at 60 FPS. They're not going to tell the developers that the level of detail needs to be higher. What it does need to do, however, as software, is it can't perform worse in a certain area. So for sake of argument, if the game's going to run at 1600p on the Neo but 1080p on the regular hardware, it can't run at a lower frame rate on the Neo. So for sake of argument, if you're once again targeting 1080p on the vanilla PS4, but you're going at 1600p on Neo, you can't also run it at 1600p at 30 FPS. Sony will not allow that. It will not pass their certification process. Okay, so all on the same page. So some folks have already started to lay out concerns that developers are unhappy about this. For example, Colin Moriarty over on Twitter said, and I quote, "A trusted source tells me developers are not happy with the PS4.5 having to develop around it, extra costs, planning and other nonsense." What he's basically saying is that if you're thinking about it, as a developer, you now have to worry about creating another version of a game. Now, how much work you put into that version really comes down to you as a studio. For example, I'm going to assume that first-party studios from Sony, let's say for the sake of argument, the Santa Monicas, the Naughty Dogs, they're probably going to put in quite a bit of extra work. You might see, let's say, better geometry, you might see better texture quality, you might see better lighting, you might see higher frame rates, you might see greater draw distances, whatever they end up doing to take advantage of the hardware. At worst, there won't be much of a difference between the Neo version of the game and the base version of the game. You could also see situations where the Neo version is more closely resembling that of the PC. So for sake of argument, you could have a higher resolution. For example, it could run at 1200p, it could run at 1440p. You might have, once again, higher anti-aliasing quality. For example, you might have MSAA times 4 compared to FXAA or something like that. You might see better lighting, you might see higher frame rates, for example. A really good, simple comparison would be, let's say, God of War 4. So obviously this has not been confirmed, this is just me giving an example, I just want to emphasize that, but you could see God of War on the vanilla regular PS4 running at 1080p 30 FPS, while on the Neo it's going to run at, let's say, 1080p 60 FPS but with higher quality assets, for example high quality textures and various other graphical enhancements, for example greater draw distances, maybe greater enemy detail, maybe better animation, lighting quality, whatever they manage to squeeze out of the system. It's fair to say that a lot of folks are putting stock into virtual reality, particularly on the PlayStation 4. I mean, the PSVR really is kind of selling itself on the fact that it's a consistent experience for developers and for gamers. At least that's how Sony were advertising it back at GDC. I'm reading out a couple of lines from their own GDC slides, and this is a quote: "Consistency of experience, every PS4 is the same, optimized for 1, optimized for 36 million. Every PS4 comes with a DualShock 4, peripherals are known, all tracking uses PS4 camera, purpose-built, optimized hardware and operating system, performance-focused, more deterministic and more control, can optimize with specialized tools, console effectively 60% more powerful than the same spec PC," end quote. Now, there's a whole bunch of different stuff that you can take away from that, but a lot of people are focusing, of course, on the first line. Every PS4 is the same, optimized for 1, optimized for 36 million. And I guess technically that's not a lie, right? Because if you've got 36 million install base of the current PS4, if you're optimizing for that PS4, well, yeah, you've basically optimized for all 36 million base PS4s that are out there. The crux of the matter is whether that's going to upset folks who are hoping to have a consistent experience across the board. When you consider that the Neo is at cheapest going to be $399 and could be up to $499. There's no been solid pricing yet. Supposedly the price was really down to the costing of the CPU. Then there's quite the difference and quite the spread But right there, that's kind of the problem. Because you can't have an install base of 36 million, but then tell those folks, well, you're not going to be able to run games for a system you only just bought. It could even be a year ago, because that's really going to piss people off. It's really hard for people to say, well, I just bought a console. If you told someone who's a PC gamer, hey, your graphics card's outdated 3 years later, you can no longer run at the highest resolution, people expect that. You know, they might say to themselves, I'm a bit disappointed, but I understand that I'm a PC gamer, and unless I'm buying like top-of-the-notch hardware, my GPU is going to get a bit out of date. I mean, for example, let's say you rushed out and bought the R9 290 back on release. You've got quite a lot of mileage out of that card, especially if you're just running at, let's say, 1080p. Whereas on the other hand, if you didn't manage to afford that on release, then yeah, you're probably going to want to upgrade pretty soon. With the PS4 or any console, that's not the case. People buy into a console thinking that they don't really need to worry about it for some time. They're good to go. And that's the issue, because it also means that it's going to be very interesting how the market reacts. By which I mean, if people can essentially play the same game on the PS4 just with better graphics, it's down to Sony to convince you and I, hey, you're going to want to part with your cash. You're going to want to buy the next PlayStation. You're going to want to upgrade your hardware for these better graphics. So, for developers, it's going to be almost like a chicken and egg situation. For them really to push the graphical effects of Neo and to put that extra time in, you've got to assume that they're going to want a good install base. And I do believe that some of this is also down to the fact that, of course, the NX is going to be launching, the new Xbox, whatever that ends up being called. I'm just going to call it the Xbox Next for lack of a better terminology. That's supposedly going to be coming out. And obviously Sony do want to keep you in the ecosystem. Don't let anyone say differently. They would much rather you go out, buy a, let's say, PlayStation VR plus the Neo, rather than for you to invest into the NX. Which isn't particularly a revolutionary statement by myself, but it also goes to show you that in some ways Sony are in a slightly worse position than, I would even go as far as to say, Nintendo and Microsoft. Now you might be scoffing and say, well, how the hell does that work? The PS4 roughly is outselling the Xbox One by 2 to 1. You've got the Wii U, which is doing not so great. I mean, you've got pretty much, you know, some optimism regarding the NX, but how are Nintendo and Microsoft in a better position than Sony? Well, with Nintendo, honestly speaking, they've got a lot of money in the bank, a ridiculous amount of money in the bank, and their handhelds are consistently selling well. Plus as well, even if the worst came to the absolute darn worst, Nintendo's IPs, they could go to any platform holder, whether it's PC or what have you, and start selling those IPs quite easily on smartphones or whatever. I don't think Nintendo would ever go that route, but they could do it. With, I guess Sony could do the same thing with its first-party studios, but mainly Sony have really focused on the PlayStation brand. With Microsoft, they've got the whole PC infrastructure, they've got smartphones, they've got tablets, and yes, their smartphone divisions have not done so well, but honestly, Microsoft, you can tell from the moves they're making, they just want you in the universal Windows platform. That's what they want. And that's not to say that Sony are in a bad position or anything like that. I'm not saying that, you know, Sony are in this tenuous position and they're losing the war or any such ridiculous claims. I'm just merely saying that Sony, they can't offer that type of service. They really need to lock you into their platform. If all of this sounds quite familiar, it should do. It's kind of close to how smartphones operate, and we've heard these comparisons for a while. I mean, let's, for sake of argument, say that you've got a Galaxy 6 and the Galaxy 7, you're eyeing it in the shops and you buy that. yeah, you can still run the same applications on the Galaxy 7. The difference is, of course, that you'll have, let's say, faster loading times, or better performance on the newer phone, or maybe a nicer screen, or whatever the changes they've happened to make from one version to another. And this, of course, would be the same of if you've got the later version of the iPhone or a tablet or whatever. They're fast and they're to the point. The problem is, it's whether we as gamers are going to tolerate that. This is the first time that we've seen, I guess you could say, an upgraded x86 based console. It's the first time in a long time that we've had an upgradable piece of hardware. I've mentioned a couple of times over, and I'm probably going to sound a bit like a broken record at this point, that I'd personally prefer that they have a system with just an upgradable slot where you just plop something in for a drastically reduced price, which is available for certain games. This is a bit like Nintendo did back in the day for the N64, or Sega did back in the day for the Saturn, you know, the RAM card upgrades, you know what I'm talking about. But obviously, when you've got an install base, in this case the PlayStation 4, you can't do that because the consoles were not conceived, they were not created with that in mind. You don't have a slot you can plug in extra RAM, you don't have a slot where you can plug in a faster GPU, and possibly that's something that Microsoft are going to consider, or Sony are going to consider in the distant future. In a perfect world, in my ideal world, I would prefer Sony to release the PlayStation 5, and for them to do it thusly. The PlayStation 5 is released in 2017 / let's say late 2017, early 2018, but you can still play PS4 games on it, so it's fully backwards compatible. But obviously, if you put in a disc into the PS5 that says PS5 on it, you're obviously going to have much better graphics, and well, it's the next obvious release of the system. On the other hand, if you put the PS5 disc into a PS4, guess what? Nothing happens. It just won't load. It's going to say disc unrecognized. It's possible, though, that internally Sony don't believe that a 4 to 5 year console lifespan is something that they can sustain in the future. And they also might not believe that they want that hard cut-off between generations. It may mean that they want some backwards compatibility. For example, and this is just a pure example, it could be that the PS4, the base PS4, let's just call it PS4 version 1, is compatible with the Neo. But the next PS4 after the Neo, so let's call it version 3, will not be compatible with version 1. Because obviously you can't release, let's say, 3 iterations, 4 iterations of the hardware in the future and still have developers target for the very lowest I guess you could say the lowest common denominator. Jesus, I got that out eventually. At the end of the day, a lot of what I'm saying is speculation. At the end of the day, a lot of what I'm saying is also potential possibilities, and some of them are pretty far-fetched, but it gives you an idea of potential ways the market could eventually go. And it's a weird situation we're currently in, because hardware is moving on really fast, and honestly, consoles just cannot keep up. I've mentioned many times over by now that the 4K displays that we're seeing are not going anywhere. They're becoming really cheap. And for consoles, there's a lot of disappointment that the consoles just can't maintain even 1080p 30 FPS in a lot of cases, let alone 1080p 60. If you were to look at the VR headsets which are being released, let's take the PSVR for sake of argument. It's a 1080p headset, right? That's 960 pixels per eye times 1080. It's not bad, the quality's pretty good, but you can't do anything with that. You can't lower the resolution because it's going to start looking really blurry because of your close proximity to the display. You can't reduce the frame rate because good luck running a frame rate really low, let's say 30 FPS on virtual reality, because that's basically going to be the worst thing you could possibly imagine. So at the end of the day, developers are kind of constrained because they have to maintain a certain resolution, a certain frame rate, so something has to give. That's what developers do all the time. They've got the option to go with higher frame rates, they've got the option to go with higher resolution, option to go with higher graphical quality in other areas, for example, once again, lighting, shadows, textures, all of that crap. But because we're moving on display so quickly, as I said, 4K is going to be out. AMD and other manufacturers, including Microsoft, are predicting we're going to be having 8K displays pretty soon. I mean, in a recent interview I had with Robert Hallock, he's saying that we're going to have 16... AMD, are targeting 16K by 16K per eye at 240 frames a second. That's what they want to get to. And obviously this is not going to happen in the next couple of years. No one is saying that they will. But hardware is going to move on really, 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 really fast. And we as gamers are going to expect that. Cell phones now are becoming increasingly more powerful. The PS4.5, the PS4 Neo, what have you, it's offering about 4.2 teraflops of computing performance, which sounds great. And it is, it's pretty impressive, until you start to compare it even to high-end PC hardware. Now I know some people aren't going to like me doing this, but you've already got PC hardware which is like 6 teraflops, 7 teraflops, and you've got dual GPU configurations which are 12 teraflops or something ridiculous. And this is only going to get more insane by the end of the year / early next year, when you've got Pascal and Polaris coming out along with their ultra high-end cards, and those cards are definitely more expensive than what's available for a console. I mean, these cards are not going to cost you like $200, $300, $400. My point is though that they are available, and developers can start targeting those for high-end virtual reality solutions. And eventually those cards become pretty normal. I mean, what was a very high-end card a couple of years back on PC is now mid-range at best. You've got the likes of the, I guess you could say the GTX 760, which was a pretty mid-range card. It's now pretty low-end. I mean, sure, it's going to be able to play most games at 1080p, high to medium settings, but if you go out and spend another $200, you could easily get a much more powerful card without too much difficulty. It's a very weird situation for us to be in. I know I've not really resolved this one. This is one of those videos which is more of a discussion with you all. I'm not really kind of enforcing my opinion on this. I really am genuinely curious what you believe. Like, would you be in or out of an iterative hardware cycle? Is that something you would support? If so, how often? Like, would you be happy if it was released throwing out there every 3 years? Let's say that Sony, Microsoft, whomever were to release a upgraded Xbox every 3 years for, let's say, $300, $400 US. Would you be happy about that? Would you be saying that's too much? Because I was reading comments on my previous video, I didn't respond to them yet, and a lot of people were saying, I'm out, I'm not doing this, or why don't I just shift to PC gaming? And it's kind of hard to argue against the shift to PC gaming. I know some people are not going to want to do that, but PC gaming is becoming so bloody easy now. Honestly, I mean, most bloody graphics drivers will automatically, if you so desire, configure the game for you. In fact, it's getting to the point now where, as I mentioned, hardware, you can get a PS4 beating machine for about $400 or $500 US without too much difficulty. And it's only going to get cheaper when Polaris comes out, or when Pascal comes out, because they're going to bring the price down for the same amount of performance, and it's going to be quite a lot of difference. I mean, we all know it's going to be 2 to 2.5 times performance per watt. So conceivably, we could be releasing a GPU which is, well, offering 2 times the performance, but quite cheap. And that's insane. I mean, in which case, the PC is going to be in a pretty good position. But with smartphones coming out, with Nintendo releasing the NX, and who knows how long the NX is going to be on top. I mean, I don't see Nintendo regularly, routinely releasing a new system, but maybe they will as well if the rest of the market forces them to do it. But then again, one thing I will say about Nintendo, and I have criticised them heavily in the past, one thing I will say about Nintendo is they tend to just do whatever the hell they want. It may not be the popular decision, it may not necessarily work out best for them in the end, but they'll do whatever they want, and if it works out for them, they're happy, great. If not, then they've experimented and they've tried something that didn't necessarily turn out the best, but hey, they were trying to innovate, they were trying to do what they wanted to do, they were trying to go against the grain, and sometimes that works great, sometimes it doesn't. It's a very, very weird situation, especially when, once again, we're hearing rumours that Microsoft are, and this is not a verbatim quote because I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's something along the lines of Microsoft are experimenting with prototype hardware by testing out components which you would normally use to upgrade your PC, which obviously means better graphics cards, better sound, better processors, better or more memory, maybe an SSD, whatever it is, whatever you would normally stick into your PC. It's absolutely crazy. Just, I don't know. This could be that the PS3, the Xbox 360 were the last normal generations, and now we might not see the same hardware that we've been used to, the same hardware cycle that we've been used to for years upon years upon years upon years. We might now see the slow movement towards a more smartphone orientated market, where hardware is released a lot faster, and we as consumers can only watch as the games developers kind of try to figure out what the hell to do in all of this. And it's going to be very interesting how studios respond to this. I'm very curious. In some ways, the fact that game engines now are so easy to configure, so easy to just, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, I'm not saying that you just press a button and the whole thing is configured, Bob's your uncle, but I imagine it's going to be almost like, let's say you've got high, medium, low settings on a PC. There's going to obviously have to be quite a lot of optimization done to make sure it meets the criteria set by Sony or Microsoft or whichever company is putting out the hardware. But I imagine that's going to be what kind of happens. So, assuming we do see that future, would you, once again, I'll ask the same question, would you be in or out? Are you happy about the Neo's release? If the Neo was in isolation, let's say we won't see another system. Let's say that we do eventually see the PS5, and Sony have just done this because they're unhappy with the performance of the vanilla system and they want that extra grunt for virtual reality. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on this one, folks. I'm really curious. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. So it's been a bit of a rambly one. I wasn't really sure where I was going with this initially when I kind of wanted to go in. I just wanted more of a discussion-y thing, as I said. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.